So I want to welcome everyone to this evening. It's a special evening for us, and as Andrea just said, it's a new collaboration, something that we haven't done before between Raven and the Sentinel Educational Foundation and the Watershed Sentinel. I'm Alice DeWolf. I'm a board member of the Sentinel Education Foundation and officially kind of co-hosting this evening tonight with Dolores Broughton, who many of you, I think, know, who's the editor of the Watershed Sentinel magazine. The home base for both of our organizations is the Comox First Nation. And as we acknowledge them, it would be great if you take, as again, Andrea suggested, take a moment and put in the chat where you're based, the land, and the Indigenous people that you would like to acknowledge. As I said, we're hosting this event from the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. We want to honor our relationship with them, appreciate their generosity, appreciate their experience, the traditions that teach us all that the land, the air, the water around us, their beauty, their ferocity, and their capacity to be abundant are inseparable from our well-being as individuals and as community. And this sort of interest of ours and wishing to acknowledge this completely flows into this evening. In the spirit of continuing to want to educate ourselves, we're hoping to introduce you all to a great new resource that's being prepared by the Raven Trust. Again, as many of you likely know, the Raven Trust is dedicated to raising funds for Indigenous peoples' access to environmental justice, based on the understanding that Indigenous peoples' victories protect us all. They've prepared a course, again, available for all of us, that they've called Our Home on Native Land. It takes us through the legal concepts that have created the need for this period of reconciliation to, in the kind of mess that we are in currently, and into an understanding of Indigenous laws that may provide us with pathways into just new relationships. And I think if we're open to the challenges, possibly a brilliantly different country. Tonight, two of its creators will take us through the outline of the course and introduce us to some of the remarkable resource people who contributed their expertise to each segment. They will, of course, also let us know how to access it for our own use, so that will keep coming up as we go through the evening. And we'll give ourselves about 15 minutes towards the end of the session. Dolores will field questions. We'd like you to drop yours into the chat, which we think is what's available to you, and we'll respond to as many of them as we can in person. But we'll also, for those that we can't, we're going to produce an online blog that handles the questions that we didn't get to. So I want to introduce you to two people. Andrea Palferman is Raven's Director of Communication. She's also a member of the Sentinel Education Foundation board, but she's fluent in many forms of digital communication and knows the importance of amplifying stories. She's a filmmaker, a researcher, grassroots organizer who's worked with groups in Canada and Africa on climate change, environmental justice, and human rights. And Conrad Young is Raven Trust's fundraising campaign director. He comes to Raven from a broad experience in nation building, politics, business, commerce, with a focus on cultural revitalization. He's been a counselor for the Ermineskin Cree Nation and is an heir to the legacy of Treaty 6. He's currently in this first cohort of Juris Indigenarian doctorate students. I love that. Doctorate students at the University of Victoria. So Conrad and Andrea, I'm going to turn over this next segment of the evening to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. Kananaskuntana kakio kapapamhat and sigas and masquachi seo tinia. I welcome you all to our event tonight. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Conrad Young, my English name. My Cree name is He Who Flies Around. I'm from the Ermineskin First Nation in Musqueam, located in central Alberta. I've been working and living on Vancouver Island for the past over 4 years now. I was part of the first cohort of the Juris Indigenorum doctorate at the University of Victoria. And I now am currently the campaigns director with Raven Trust. So I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our work here in preparation for today's event. It has taken place and is taking place on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Hulkaminam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Raven is deeply grateful for the lands, waters, beings, and First Peoples of what is often referred to as Vancouver Island. And Raven supports our most gracious hosts in their continued stewardship of the relatives whose stories we're telling and the lands we stand in, and some of us, including myself, refer to as home. These stories of home on native land are precisely that. Our legal theory of change is sanctioned to allow First Peoples partners to lead their own paths when seeking refuge in remedial actions that our courts are structured to provide. The honor of the Crown is always at the heart of these unresolved issues. We all are here to learn more so that we as Canadians can locate ourselves inside the parlors of these newfound judicial spaces, which is still only at the beginning of First Peoples' histories of jurisprudence within our democracy. Raven Created the World is a universal story amongst all Indigenous coastal peoples. The work for this project has taken place on their unceded ancestral lands. I am so deeply honored for the lands, waters, beings, and peoples of the First Nations. When invited, Raven shares in their continued stewardship of the relatives whose stories we're telling. Raven's vision is a country that honors the ancestral laws, rights, and stewardship values of Aboriginal peoples in their equitable access to the justice system within a thriving natural environment. Our mission is to raise legal defense funds to assist Indigenous peoples who enforce their rights and title to protect their traditional territories. I'd like to turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Conrad. So I'm Andrea. I'm a settler of Scottish and Irish ancestry, transplant to so-called British Columbia. And I've been with Raven for some time. We keep encountering in our work a really neat spectrum of people, everyone from people like, Conrad, say, who's been a counselor with the nation and deeply steeped in both the common and Indigenous legal traditions of his peoples, and then people, and I confess, like me, who went to school at a time where we learned nothing, really nothing about contemporary First Nations experience. So one of the reasons Raven is doing this is essentially to educate that spectrum of people. There's quite a lot of other people who are doing courses like this, online courses that give you, a grounding in Indigenous rights, but most of them are either quite dry, or academic or out of date. So we wanted something that would reach beyond just the usual suspects. People who are working on teams in a store, teenagers who are going to high school and they have to do a project, curious Canadians who are not, rabid activists like many of us on this call are. So we thought, well, let's make it funny. Let's make it not light, but let's actually use the absurdity of many of the legal frameworks that we're still standing on to poke a bit of fun and lighten up the conversation so people feel welcome into it instead of like they might do something wrong and be canceled. So we invited Ryan McMahon, who's really hilarious Anishinaabe comedian and journalist. He did the Thunder Bay series with Canada Land. If you haven't heard it, it's brilliant. And we put it up on a platform. You can see here the URL is homeonnativeland.com. And essentially, we've only given access to these materials immediately as this kind of sneak peek to our monthly donors. So if you want to start this course tonight, you can become a monthly donor to Raven and you will receive it. And otherwise, everyone else is welcome to jump in January 1st. So this is really a sneak peek for you all and to give you an idea of what's to come. And everybody who's on this webinar will receive an invitation when the course drops. So I just also want to add that we're really not the experts that have put this material together. We are hosts to a conversation. And so we reached out to a lot of really smart Indigenous lawyers around the country and legal experts. And so we encourage you to take the course to learn from them. We'll do our best in the Q&A at the end, but do be aware that we're also learning and our students ourselves. So tonight we've decided because, yes.
Andrea, Andrea, if I could interrupt you just for a second. It looks like we're not able to see anything in the chat. And so I think we want people to know that we're going to work on this, as you're speaking, so that we can actually find out what people are telling us in the chat. Okay, so I think carry on.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so we're going to focus tonight on the intersection between Indigenous rights and environmental justice, and to understand that we pretty much have to start at the very beginning. So, the doctrine of discovery. Many of you have heard of this. Since the 1500s, the doctrine of discovery has been used to take lands away from Aboriginal peoples. The doctrine of discovery assumed that Christians had a superior way of doing things. And because Aboriginal peoples weren't using the land in a way that Europeans could recognize in an extractive way, settlers used this concept called terra nullius to disenfranchise Aboriginal peoples from their lands and waters. While we may think we've outgrown the ideas of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, they still form the basis of how land ownership and rights are afforded in North America. So the DNA of the doctrine of discovery is still in many of Canada's laws and policies. So there's some cartoons in this series. This one just uses the analogy of, that's my car. Because I'm a Christian and you're not, I have a right to use this car. I'm going to use it to its full benefit. You're not using it properly. You weren't even driving it. And he's shaking the keys saying, well, I was about to. So same sort of thing. I stole your car because you weren't driving it properly. It's a pretty good way of describing the absurdity and ridiculousness of the doctrine of discovery as a basis for land ownership and stealing land from others. So we come to your legal history sandwich. The story that Canada has told itself is incomplete and one-sided. In the story of colony to nation, Indigenous peoples were part of nation building in the early days, helping settlers survive. They participated in the fur trade, and then they went quiet for 200 years when suddenly they started showing up and demanding their rights. That basically would be what I might have learned in school, minus the last part. Home on Native Land tells the story of what was going on in the meantime. So newcomers, settlers, invaders, whatever you want to choose as a term, needed to be friends with Indigenous people who could teach them how to survive in unfamiliar landscapes. Importantly, Indigenous nations did not give up land ownership through treaty. So the treaties gave growing numbers of settlers in Canada access to land. They made promises, including special rights to treaty lands for hunting, fishing, and gathering, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. They also included some cash payments and allocation of reserve lands, and they weren't signed in large areas of the country. So that's what we mean when we talk about unceded land. More about that in a minute. So many of the treaties were made with one of the parties, the Crown, believing that the central feature of the treaty was the purchase or extinguishment of the other party's Aboriginal title. So essentially converting Aboriginal land to either fee simple or Crown land. While the very idea of selling or extinguishing their land rights was beyond the contemplation of the Aboriginal party, because the nature of their relationship to the land was completely different. We don't own the land owns us is a very common and commonly understood way of thinking about belonging to land as opposed to the land belonging to oneself. So Indigenous peoples have long resisted the idea that they surrendered title to their lands in the courts, on the streets, and on the land. Now, a new generation of Aboriginal rights lawyers, steeped in Indigenous concepts of sovereignty, are pursuing this resistance through legal challenges that are overturning old assumptions and ushering in new possibilities. So we're really excited that you can meet some of these people when you sign up for Home on Native Land. So you can see the website here, available January 1st. And for whippersnappers who want to support Raven's work and at the same time have access to this resource right away, please sign up as a monthly donor. We'll give you that URL in a follow-up email and also at the end of this webinar. So over to you, Conrad. We're going to move now into, that was kind of the overview of how we got to where we are right now. Now we'll talk about environmental law.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. So environmental law focuses on protecting the integrity of the environment and the promotion of sustainable societies. Environmental law and common law evolved to address often destructive and dysfunctional ways that humans interact with the natural world. This includes making air and water pollution laws, protecting endangered species, and regulating natural resource development. Environmental law in Western legal systems was not developed with Indigenous worldviews in mind. Had it been, we would likely have healthier relationships with the natural world that don't cause the destruction of our planet's climate. In other words, the world may look very different today. The question, whose land is it anyway, is integral to any discussion of environmentalism in Canada. The biggest difference between common law systems in Canada and Indigenous legal frameworks is that the common law, humans are placed above nature. Everything else, animals, plants, and water, is understood according to property rights. Damage is assessed according to how harmful any action's impacts are to humans through the lens of the value of a natural resource. In stark contrast, most, if not all, indigenous legal traditions hold that law is constituted out of relationships with the natural world. Humans are imbued with responsibilities to maintain the balance with living systems. When damages occurs, the law is used to determine how a person will remedy an imbalance. Environmental racism. In North America, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have fought for hundreds of years to protect the air, land, water, species, and cultural connections to the land from discriminatory policies and actions. In 1982, Benjamin Chavez, a Black civil rights leader from the United States, coined the term environmental racism. Environmental racism is a form of systemic racism rather than individual racism. That means it is the result of institutional policies and practices rather than individual beliefs and actions. Systemic racism is embedded in the laws, policies, and institutions that govern our lives, and it has been since European settlers first colonized this land. Today, this manifests as citing polluting industrial sites and other environmentally hazardous projects near BIPOC communities, and inadequate environmental standards or enforcement for those polluting industries, companies operating near racialized communities. In BC, the maximum penalties for dumping garbage or waste on Crown land range from $2,000 to $1 million. Meanwhile, the maximum penalty for dumping garbage or waste on Indian reserves is only $100. In 2020, a UN Special Rapporteur found that there exists a pattern in Canada where marginalized groups and Indigenous peoples in particular find themselves on the wrong side of a toxic divide, subject to conditions that would not be acceptable anywhere else in Canada. In Northern Ontario, Grassy Narrows First Nation has been without clean drinking water for 25 years due to industrial pollution, while the nearby De Beers mine is fully supplied. Projects situated on Indigenous land like the TMX pipeline or Coastal GasLink have gone ahead despite nations having proposed alternative routes during constitutionally mandated consultations. It's important to acknowledge the mainstream environmental movement's complicity in upholding environmental racism. In his original definition, Chavez listed the history of excluding our people of color from leadership of the ecology movements as an example of environmental racism. This shortcoming has hindered the movement's ability to achieve justice for all. Environmental organizations, including Raven, can and must.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Huge apologies, guys. I didn't realize that would happen. Now I have to find the, the presentation again.
Can and must do better to acknowledge their past and commit to an anti-racist framework going forward. Environmental rights and responsibilities. Environmental rights are based on human rights frameworks and spell out what specific environmental conditions people are entitled to. These rights recognize that the natural world has a direct effect on a person's ability to live and enjoy that life. Though people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, are working on it, there is no constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment in Canada. There are provinces and territories in Canada which recognize this right. For instance, the Constitution of Nunavut Inuit Territory in Newfoundland and Labrador recognizes the human right to a healthy environment, pointing directly to individual responsibilities alongside their rights. Every Labrador Inuk has the right to an environment that is not harmful to his or her health or well-being, and to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable Inuit laws. Every Labrador Inuk has a responsibility to use and enjoy Nunatsiavut and its environment and renewable and non-renewable resources with care and respect, without waste or greed, and as a steward for future generations of Labrador Inuit. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, while it enshrines rights to life, liberty, and security, does not spell out the link between a right to life and, for example, the right to clean drinking water. There is a fundamental separation between humans and the natural world, creating a culture that exploits natural resources for human benefit and is only restricted by environmental law. We cannot help but wonder what our landscapes would look like if we incorporated respect for all natural beings into the roots of Canadian law. Parks and Rec. The National Park System in Canada is one example of a view of stewardship where land is held in trust by the federal government.
Oh, goodness. Apologies.
Okay. For the people of Canada and for the world. The mandate of Parks Canada is to maintain or restore ecosystems to a state where it's unimpaired and likely to continue being healthy. While that might sound good, to think of a natural space as unimpaired by humans discredits the stewardship practices of Indigenous peoples that,
sorry. Back to slideshow. Sorry, Conrad.
it's okay.
We were here, yeah? Is that right? No.
Not yet.
Yeah, I think this was the one. Maybe we'll just start from the next slide. Sorry, everybody. Conrad, do you want me to just pick up here?
I don't even see the slides right now. Sorry.
Oh, goodness.
One sec.
Okay, yeah, screen sharing is paused, it says, and I don't really know why that is. Resume share.
I
That,
can just keep reading from my notes here.
yeah. Um,
So environmental rights and responsibilities are based on human rights frameworks and spell out what specific environmental conditions people are entitled to. These rights recognize that the natural world has a direct effect on a person's ability to live and enjoy life. Oh, shoot, this isn't the right one. Sorry, guys.
mhm.
So while that might sound good, to think of a natural space as unimpaired by humans discredits the stewardship practices of Indigenous peoples from time immemorial that kept the land healthy while supporting sustainable cultures for tens of thousands of years. The formation of national parks required the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their territories. Lands were set aside not just to preserve the environment, but to conserve game populations for sport hunting and tourism. In the late 1800s, Indigenous people were banned from national, provincial, and municipal parks. Indigenous hunters were prohibited from hunting in parks, including Banff National Park and Algonquin National Park, as they had done for millennia. Parks are now complicated spaces that have excluded Indigenous peoples in pursuit of a co-modified version of untouched nature, where settlers can visit and play as a trade-off for non-park lands that can be exploited and degraded. In other words, national and provincial parks exist so that other land areas, which are often stolen or in violation of a treaty agreement, can be exploited for their resources. Indigenous peoples have been greatly harmed by these ideals of untouched wilderness because those notions have attempted to erase their presence and knowledge of the land. The millennia spanning work to develop and maintain human to land relationships is based on Indigenous legal frameworks rooted in caretaking and reciprocity. The worldview informs stewardship practices that don't begin and end with a park. Guardians and watchmen. Indigenous guardians or watchmen are part of the Indigenous legal traditions, much as police and park rangers, and are part of the common law traditions known as guardians or watchmen. These on the land stewards are engaged in the eyes and the ears of the land and the water. In West Coast nations, the authority of guardians flows from hereditary chiefs who are tasked with upholding ancient and ongoing stewardship relationships. For example, the Heiltsuk Nation of Bella Bella on BC's central coast abide by the legal principle of Givilis. Hereditary chiefs and their right-hand men and women, auks, oversee the management of herring, guided by customary laws, teachings, and beliefs. This is a vast network of guardian watchmen stretching along the BC coast responsible for monitoring the land and enforcing Indigenous law, often in collaboration with Parks Canada. They provide the important detailed information that informs policy around fisheries and wildlife management to protect vulnerable populations from further harm and allow for the recovery of endangered species free from human interference. The battle for Lael Island. In the 1980s, Haida Gwaii was faced with a rampant clear-cut forestry in its old-growth rainforests. Haida and local supporters came together to protect the remaining stands of ancient cedar trees and important marine sites on Lael Island. Direct action by Indigenous peoples resulted in the arrests of many elders, community members, and leaders. Through a combination of assertion of Indigenous law over unceded territory, direct action, legal action, and negotiation with the Canadian government, the federal government negotiated and signed the Gwaii-Hanas Agreement and created a national park reserve. In 2010, Bowie Seamount was designated a national marine conservation area with Gwaii-Hanas Marine Agreement. These agreements bring together common and Indigenous law to provide frameworks for shared resource management of land and marine ecosystems. The Haida Nation's experience offers an example of how shared governance between Indigenous nations and the federal government can work. From out of a standoff that pitted loggers against Indigenous land protectors, a shared governance and stewardship framework emerged based on Indigenous legal traditions of consensus-based decision-making. That pattern of Indigenous peoples is asserting their laws outside of the Canadian legal frameworks is a leading edge of environmental stewardship. Relationships between hereditary leadership and elected band councils are complex, and indigeneity is not a monolith. Still, there is common ground in that the values and practices enshrined in Indigenous law, together with ecological knowledge passed down through the generations, are deeply rooted in principles of an ecology that sees humans as part of an interconnected system of interreliance.
All right.
Andrea?
Thank you, Conrad. Thanks for bearing with us through the awkwardness of trying to solve the chat problem, which is solved. So if you didn't have a chance before to check in and say who you are and where you're from, we're very happy to welcome you now in the chat. And it's kind of nearly just in time because we're about to shift into the Q&A. I'm just going to say a few more things here, and this is more an overview of, again, back to, well, why are we doing this program at all? So I don't know if you could read his t-shirt, but it says, my ancestors had their land stolen and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek commentary on Orange Shirt Day, which is beautiful and really moving. And so many Indigenous people really appreciate when the streets turn that color of solidarity. So it's an important thing to do and an important way to acknowledge the crimes of the residential school era. But it means a lot more if you pair that sentiment with action. And I would imagine if we did a whip round of everybody who's on this webinar, we would be amazed at the ways that you're committing and stepping forward and doing great things in your communities. We're just here to offer you some more. So learn is what we're here tonight to do. So signing up for homeonnativeland.com. You can actually go to the website right now and just join Raven's mailing list, and then you'll get notified. As I said before, you can join Raven as a monthly donor, raventrust.com/donate. And I know it might feel like a bit of a hard sell, but this is our year-end fundraising drive. And really the funds that we raise right now power our work for the whole rest of the year, and monthly donors are the absolute backbone of that. So we take your money and we give it to Indigenous nations who are in court to stop pipelines, push back against open pit mines, protect thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares of lands, and create better laws. So really the transformation of this country happens on many levels. You know, we talked about on the street and on the land and in the courts, but Raven is there to sustain Indigenous people when they go to court, because some of these cases last, and I'm not joking, decades. And in order to have the stamina and the financial stamina to meet the Crown, essentially the Canadian or provincial governments, we need a movement of people, because nations have been chronically underfunded and their land base has been removed, and it's very difficult to meet the deep pockets of Canada or BC or Alberta in court when essentially they have an unlimited resource of taxpayer dollars. So it's another reason why the word Raven and the kind of trickster notion is so poetic in our work, because essentially we are taking your money and using it to empower people who have been traditionally disenfranchised from the legal system. We also give you a tax receipt. So we're just redirecting the flow of funds to places that where really they go a very long way to changing our common future. Another way that you can get involved is to volunteer with Raven. We have a kind of new, exciting volunteer program. So please do check us out. If you have spare time, if you have skills to spare, if you like meeting people and doing tables at events, or if you like to organize, we really want to hear from you. So just circling back to where we started with the car, you know, there's a lot of, I would call it red washing that is going on in media speak and politics speak. So here we are back at the car, and the guy that stole the car is saying, oh, let's reconcile and put the past behind us. And the Indigenous guy says, awesome. I will take my car back. And it's like, oh, no, no, I'm not gonna give it back to you. No, no, no. Maybe we'll like, give you a loan and you can maybe borrow it from us. And none of those things are really going far enough. So looking to the future, and people like Conrad, very much the future, these, powerful Indigenous leaders who are not compromising in moving forward in a way that honors their ancestors, but also honors like the kind of future that we all really need. And that's a future that does not put humans at the top of a pyramid. It puts us right in the web of relationships with all living things.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Maybe if I could speak to just 3 little items during our presentation. I want to go back to the treaty narrative. I think it was in the first or second slide.
Sure thing. Yeah, get started and I'll try to find
the trick or treaty slide.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the beginning. And while Andrea's queuing that up, I just want to speak to this, the importance here of the second bullet, promises made, including special rights to the treaty lands for hunting, fishing, and gathering. Quote, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. I'd also like to note that, I've been told from elders at treaty meetings that I've been privy to, that there's a concept there also that was not written on purpose. And what I want to draw the attention to is that Canada and most of its systems look at the treaty aspect as a contract. Well, of course, the First Nations people see it as a covenant. And in that covenant, there's a section that was left out on purpose, and that is, and the wind blows. And there was a reason why that spirit was left out from the written article in the explanations of this covenant. The second thing I'd like to speak about is when we referenced fee simple and crown land, formerly known as common land, was supposed to be the set aside shared territories between the new settlers and the First Peoples, was the common lands that then became crown lands. But I think it's, there's 2 important things, and then I'll end. One is, a lot of people don't know that every reserve in Canada was supposed to have a 25-mile radius of buffer between the reserve populace and the outside peoples. Now, if you think of how important that is in regards to assimilation, imagine a country where it was that visible that the reserves were surrounded by this buffer of protection to I guess perhaps make the relationship of integration a little easier. But what's really important about that is that there's this new area that the municipalities of Canada are really echoing in the legislatures, and that's on green zones, what they're called, and white zones. And so again, the encroachment of what used to be common lands and now crown lands is now again kind of at stake with these green zones and white zones that municipalities are looking for in expansion for shared territories. Thank you.
How about Dolores? We pass it over to you and you can lead us into the next part.
Okay, well, first, Conrad, I did not understand why they left the wind out.
I stand to be corrected at any time, but because of the spirit itself, there was a purpose and reason. So if you'll notice, the spirit of the sun is there, the spirit of the grass, and the spirit of the rivers, and the wind blows was the 4th piece of that testimony.
Oops. Oh, you're muted.
No, that's fine. I wasn't saying anything else. Sorry.
You weren't saying anything. Okay.
Oh, you didn't hear me?
I heard
I
his, I heard his,
apologize.
I heard a little of it.
Yeah. So it was left out on purpose. Why that purpose, I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask, but from what I've come to understand, it was about the sacredness specific to that spirit in reference to being written.
Okay, okay. Yeah.
And
Okay.
because it's a covenant and not a contract, it's under the covenant that what I gather is that spirit wasn't supposed to be mentioned in writing for a reason.
Mhm. Sure. That does make sense to me. We don't have a lot of questions in the chat yet, but we have monthly donors praising Raven.
Yes.
We have.
Dolores.
Mhm.
I actually would like to intervene here just for a minute.
Okay.
I actually would like people to get a sense of what they're going to see when they go to the website. I know that it's sort of, you know, that the course has got segments, right? And you said something about the resource people that you have drawn on, and I was wondering whether you could give us just a quick introduction to who some of those people are, you know, so that we know, like, you know, so that we know that who we would be connecting with, you know, as we kind of work through the course.
Thank
Andrea.
you. Yes, yes, we were going to kind of do some thank yous at the end, but I think this is a really appropriate time to talk about some of those people. So they're all Indigenous lawyers. So we have Terry Lynn Williams Davidson. There was some talk about Haida Gwaii, and she is essentially the Haida's lawyer. And originally, I don't think she thought that her entire life would be devoted to these sorts of cases for her people, but that's entirely what she's doing. So she's one of the resource people that comes on. Dr. John Borrows, who's also on Raven's advisory panel. We have a legal advisory panel, and he is Anishinaabe. He is an incredible poetic teacher. He's also the co-founder with another of our presenters, Dr. Val Napoleon, of the joint Indigenous common law degree program that Conrad is involved with. So that's really the, you know, and I did notice in the chat, there was a question that related to the idea that it's profoundly unjust that Indigenous peoples have to come and defend themselves in a colonial court. And the question was worded a little more elegantly than that, but this is one of the ways that is changing, because Indigenous laws and Indigenous legal orders are being stood up as older and more profoundly connected to the land and of the land than common laws. And they're being used in arguments in court. And it started with oral history being admitted in the Delgamuukw case, and now it's all the way up to in the Haida case. Indigenous nations often issuing like credos or edicts, you want to call them, like declarations based on their law that later the Canadian government catches up to. Yeah, so it's a kind of in tandem play, and John Borrows and Val Napoleon are hugely on the vanguard of training like a whole new cohort of people who just think completely differently about law in this country. It's not the primacy of one over the other, it's more like a braiding of these legal traditions to make a very strong rope. Another person in this series is Johnny Mack, Jeff Corntassel, Cookby Judy Wilson. I'm just going to actually go to the course so you can get a real sneak preview. Hopefully you can still see my screen share here. Ponderously slow internet. So maybe ask another question, Dolores.
Well, I just want to note that someone has mentioned in the chat that the map on the graphic doesn't show Vancouver Island or Haida Gwaii, and that it just doesn't look like Canada without these islands. So I just thought that just to stir up a little trouble here.
Yeah, noted.
Okay.
I could tell the story of the map really quickly. I mean, the map is kind of a lovely story. We had kind of stumbled across this graphic online, and we went to find out who'd made it. And it turned out it was a non-Indigenous artist whose work we found when we Googled it. And that was disappointing. And we hired an Indigenous artist to kind of dig into it and possibly recreate the map, but actually do it. And a guy called John Velton, who's Dene. And he did some more digging and asked around and found that actually the original of this concept of the map of Canada as Indigenous creatures was done by a Haisla and Heiltsuk guy called Mervyn Windsor. And so John and Mervyn teamed up together and digitized the map and brought it back to life for this program. So Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii, maybe we can ask them to tack those on.
Hey, no tacking here. Yeah, I also want to note that we have people who have come into this, zoomed in, as they say, zoomed in from all over. It's truly inspiring. I think just about every part of Canada, or what we call Canada, has people there, many settlers and some Indigenous people as well. So did you want to go on with that, showing the content, Andrea?
Well, I wouldn't mind. I'll just give you a sense of what it's like once you're logged in. So there's 10 lessons, and each one consists of a video, which is, a good 20-minute video. So this isn't like a light do it in one night course. We're suggesting people take up to 6 weeks. But once you're logged in, you can come here and you can actually watch the video. And this is the one with Jeff Corntassel, and you'll see our host, Ryan McMahon.
Democracy. And therein lies the rub.
He does a great intro, kind of Jonathan Pye style. And then he sits down and has sort of face-to-face or via Zoom, because we created this. And of course, the pandemic came along in the middle of it. And, Ryan plays the foil. So he plays, ask smart people stupid questions. And so it really keeps it moving along, and the conversations are fantastic. So you can watch the video, and then it moves to the lessons themselves. And you really got a sense, like essentially Conrad shared an entire lesson with you about environmental law. They're all blended with these cartoons, and the cartoons are more robust than what you got a glimpse of. They were created by a guy who actually volunteered for us, a fantastic cartoonist called Warren Langley, who will continue to do work for Raven. And we storyboarded these together, and he created the cartoons. And then at the end of each lesson, there's a little reflection exercise. And, this circles back to why we're doing this in the first place. And it's really so that you are equipped to wade into those conversations that sometimes go sideways when people are just operating from assumptions or half truths. And, we live in a world of half-truth news. So we wanted to equip people so that you could feel comfortable and feel confident to raise these topics and issues, and with examples to back up maybe some of the points that you're trying to make. And so here's like the reflection questions. And they're also, if you're a teacher and you're taking your grade 10 class through this would be a good assignment. For instance, one of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, one of the 94 calls, is actually for businesses to educate themselves and educate their employees. So if you work somewhere and are a staff member, by all means, tell your boss, manager, colleagues about this resource, because it's actually on businesses as one of the calls to action. It's the only call to action that actually relates directly to businesses. The onus is on you to become educated, and this is kind of a perfect starting point for that. And we're happy to do webinars similar to this or customize them for businesses and workplaces. So you can sort of call Raven and say, oh, there's 10 of us and we'd like to get together and bring the staff and have a walkthrough. We're really keen on doing that.
Okay, so we have some questions. I'd like to try and get through them. We have 10 minutes left. Someone wanted to know where they could find out more about the sacred spirit wind. I don't know if there's some kind of course or if it's just you learn as you live. I'm not. Conrad?
Yeah, I guess what I'd recommend is most First Peoples deal with the protocol of tobacco, which is a presentation on whatever request that you're bringing to what would be, I guess, an elder of the community. or somebody who has kind of an expertise in those areas. I know I can't speak for the other Indigenous peoples of Canada, but for the Plains Cree, the reason why tobacco is sacred and is the protocol bringer is because it is given the ability to sanction kind of the supernatural in order to give credit to what's being shared. And so it was the first plant that Creator placed on the earth in our history of creation story. And that's why it's sacred. So I would recommend to use, I guess, the protocols that are common to most Indigenous peoples, which would be to bring tobacco. And there are treaty gatherings in Canada every year, different times of the year. I would encourage you to just take a Google search, find the nearest treaty gathering, treaties 1 to 11. And if it's in your area, bring that tobacco directly there. And that's where you'll get the answer for your questions with the protocol.
And see, people are asking what the difference is between contracts and covenants, or a contract and a covenant.
Well, I guess the simplest thing is a contract is something that the Canadian common law holds in kind of the highest regards. And most of us are trained in that school of thought, being, kind of born into the Canadian academic system. I guess the contrast of the covenant is that it's you are now involving the supernatural. It to me, it's larger than just a contract that you can break. What it comes with, though, for the First Peoples is the obligations, and the obligations are to the natural beings around us, the water, the bugs, the animals, and things like the elements, like the wind.
Okay. And I know this isn't actually part of it, of this, but people are very confused. I see several questions about what are you talking about, green zones and white zones? And I think that might be a Doug Ford thing, but I'm not sure myself. So who can take that one on?
Well, I don't mind, Dolores, as I was speaking about it earlier. What I do is I'd encourage you all to look at some of, the plans that are amalgamated into what happened, I think, yesterday or today with the announcement of Bill 1, the Sovereignty Act of Alberta, and dig a little deeper into the legislative plans regarding that Sovereignty Act. And I think you'll find in the legislatures of all provinces and maybe the territories, you'll find these newly kind of conceptualized pieces of legislation that speak to these white and green zones that I'm talking about.
Okay, but what, the green zones where nature's allowed and the white zones for white people to do extraction, or what?
No. Sorry, it's got nothing to do with race. It's just kind of the terminology. I think what it has to deal with is hunting and fishing areas, as well as biodiversities. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then someone else is asking for some advice. They're apparently, where they are, the School Act requires the anthem to be sung, O Canada, at 3 assemblies each year, and they'd like to take this on. And they're wondering if you guys have any advice on how to raise this discussion.
I mean, it's such a great conversation. It's like exactly the kind of conversation that we hope that this resource sparks, actually. One thing that could be interesting is approach the school board or even a particular teacher and suggest that they take this course as a preamble to, we're going to have a community conversation about why this song might need an accompaniment, whether it's an explanation or even a corollary song from an Indigenous culture that's nearby, or maybe it's not appropriate to sing that song at all. But, you know, to have that discussion raw without people being grounded in some of the facts of history can be very, people come with their biases and assumptions. So if they could kind of Trojan horse a course like this into the school, under the guise of this is what we're going to do for Orange Shirt Day, is everyone's going to take this course, then and I'm not just being a salesperson here. I really think it's dangerous sometimes to have these sorts of dialogues cold with people who maybe have no grounding whatsoever. And we can't assume anyone over 30 even knows anything, has any idea. They may not be able to name the treaty that they're under or the nation whose land they're on. So yeah, that's just the first thing that comes to mind, but I love the conversation. We could have a whole other webinar about that. We could write a new version of O Canada, maybe with like more upbeat, you know, it's kind of
Yeah, a bit more beat. Yeah, beat, period.
yeah.
If I may, Dolores, I'd like to focus on the introduction of the, you know, our national anthem and, you know, native land. That's exactly why we developed this webinar. And so, you know, if we look at it from that unifying aspect, you know, that's the reason we're driving these conversations and developing these pieces of education that aren't mainstream yet.
Mhm. It will take time, but it can be done. But we're looking at a whole different way of life, actually. It's going to be, I think it's really exciting. And I see many thank yous as well in the chat to you, Gordon, to Raven in general. And I'm sure they're also thanking Alice from the Sentinel Educational Foundation and the Watershed Sentinel. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Yeah,
Thank
I'd
you,
really
ladies.
like to jump in before we come
Oh,
off and say
okay,
thank you
sorry.
to you, Dolores and Alice, for hosting this conversation and for having us and for everything that the Sentinel does to keep everybody so well informed. I think that you really can't underestimate the power of independent media. So on the Christmas giving front, please think of the Sentinel. It's a subscription to the Sentinel is a great present. I also really need to thank Warren Langley for his fantastic cartoons, Lena Minifee and the team at Stories First, Jason Bogus, thank you so much for helping shape this resource. And of course, all the incredible presenters, all of you who are here tonight. And please have the conversation, carry it on, let the ripples ripple.
I think we're going to have a lot of people joining that course. And I really expect that there's going to be a lot to follow up from this. Good night.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, great reaction.